If this relationship ended tomorrow, would your life actually change? Not your feelings, your routine. Would there be fewer messages to send, fewer plans to organize, fewer explanations to give? Or were you already doing most of that alone? This isn't a list to blame anyone, and it's not about who cared more. These are moments, quiet ones, moments you noticed but ignored, because admitting them would have changed everything. Let's start with the first one. Number 1. You stopped expecting them to initiate. At some point, you stopped expecting them to reach out first. Not consciously. You didn't make a decision about it. You just adjusted. You noticed that plans only happened after you suggested them. Conversations only started after you checked in. So you filled that role. You told yourself it wasn't a big deal, that some people just aren't initiators, that this is how relationships naturally balance out. But here's the quiet shift you didn't notice at the time. You stopped waiting for effort and started providing it by default. Not because they asked you to, because it felt easier than sitting with the silence. You didn't feel rejected, you felt responsible. And that's how it normalized. When they didn't initiate, you didn't question it, you compensated for it. And once that happened, initiative stopped being something they needed to offer, because the relationship still moved forward, with you pushing it. That's not love fading, that's effort being reassigned. And the moment you stopped expecting them to try, you quietly accepted that trying was your job now. Number 2. You felt relief when they finally showed effort. There was a moment when they finally showed effort again. They initiated, they planned something, they checked in without being reminded. And the feeling you had wasn't excitement, it was relief. Relief that you didn't have to carry everything, at least not that day. That's when something important had already changed, because effort wasn't expected anymore. It was appreciated like a favor. You didn't think this is normal. You thought, I'm glad they did this. And that small reaction says more than it should. In a balanced relationship, effort feels mutual. It doesn't arrive like a surprise. But here, it felt rare enough to stand out, rare enough to be noticed, rare enough to feel grateful for. You didn't call it a problem, you called it progress. But real effort doesn't come in bursts. It doesn't show up just enough to reset your hope. When you feel relief instead of reassurance, it means effort stopped being consistent long before you admitted it. And the fact that you accepted that relief isn't a flaw. It's a sign you had already been doing more than your share, for longer than you realized. Number 3. You explained their absence before they ever had to. Before they had a chance to explain themselves, you already did it for them. You told yourself they were busy, that work was stressful, that life was overwhelming right now. And maybe all of that was true. But notice what happened next. They didn't need to clarify. They didn't need to reassure you. They didn't need to adjust their behavior, because you removed the pressure before it ever reached them. When replies came late, you softened the meaning. When plans stayed vague, you lowered expectations. Not out of denial, out of empathy. You didn't want to add weight to their life. You didn't want to seem demanding, so you carried the uncertainty quietly. And over time, that became the pattern. Their absence didn't create tension, it created explanations. And when absence has explanations, it stops asking for effort. This is how imbalance becomes invisible, not because someone is intentionally distant, but because distance is constantly justified. You weren't being naive, you were being understanding. But understanding without boundaries turns into permission. And the moment you started explaining their absence, you also stopped expecting them to show up differently. Number 4, you lowered your needs so they wouldn't feel pressured. You didn't stop needing things, you just stopped asking for them. You noticed that every time you brought something up, the energy shifted. They became quieter, more distant, less available. So you adjusted. You told yourself you didn't need much anyway, that you were low maintenance, that wanting less made things easier for everyone. You stopped asking for clarity. You stopped asking for consistency. You stopped asking for reassurance and called it independence. But that wasn't independence, that was self-reduction. You weren't becoming stronger, you were becoming smaller, so the relationship wouldn't feel heavy to them. And the most subtle part is this: they never asked you to lower your needs. You did it preemptively, because it felt safer than risking their withdrawal. Over time, your silence became convenient, your flexibility became expected, your understanding became the baseline. And once your needs disappeared from the conversation, so did the incentive to meet them. This is how imbalance stabilizes, not through conflict, but through accommodation. And the moment you started shrinking yourself to keep things comfortable, you weren't just carrying the relationship anymore, you were protecting it from the truth of what you needed. Number 5, you confused patience with progress. You told yourself that time would fix it, that if you stayed calm, if you didn't push, if you gave things room to breathe, effort would eventually come back. So you waited. You watched days turn into patterns, patterns turn into habits, and habits turn into your new normal. Nothing really improved, but nothing officially ended either, and that felt like movement. You mistook stability for growth, silence for peace, lack of conflict for connection. But patience only works when there's something moving on the other side. Here, there wasn't. Time wasn't repairing anything, it was just making the imbalance more familiar. You weren't being patient with progress, you were being patient with stagnation. And the longer you waited, the harder it became to admit that waiting itself had become the problem. Because leaving would mean accepting that time didn't help, that effort didn't return, that patience wasn't rewarded. So you stayed patient instead. Not because things were getting better, but because acknowledging they weren't would have forced you to choose differently. Number 6, you started managing the relationship for both of you. At some point, the relationship stopped being shared and started being managed. You remembered important dates, you checked in at the right moments, you adjusted plans before they had to, not because you wanted control, because you wanted stability. You became the one who noticed when distance crept in, the one who corrected course, the one who kept things from falling apart. And slowly, without any discussion, that role became yours. They didn't need to pay attention to the connection anymore. You were already doing that. You reminded them of conversations. You smoothed over awkward gaps. You kept the emotional rhythm steady so they wouldn't have to. That's when love quietly turned into logistics. You weren't building intimacy together. You were maintaining functionality alone. And here's the part most people miss. The more you managed, the less reason they had to participate. Not out of laziness, out of adaptation. Because when one person carries the structure, the other learns they don't need to. And once you realize you've been managing the relationship instead of experiencing it, you're already much further in than you ever intended to be. Number 7, you stopped bringing things up because it never changed anything. You didn't stop communicating because you didn't care. You stopped because nothing changed. Every time you tried to talk about it, The conversation circled back to the same place. Apologies, explanations, promises that sounded sincere, and then nothing adjusted. So you learned the pattern. Bringing it up didn't lead to effort, it just led to temporary reassurance. You didn't want to argue. You didn't want to nag. You didn't want to feel like you were asking for something that should have been obvious. So you stayed quiet, not because you were okay, but because speaking felt pointless. You told yourself silence was maturity, that letting things go was strength, that repeating yourself would only push them further away. But silence didn't protect the relationship. It protected the imbalance. Because when issues stopped being named, they stopped being addressed. And the moment you stopped bringing things up, you also stopped being heard. That's when the relationship became easier for them and heavier for you. Not because you gave up, but because you realized that your words no longer carried enough weight to change anything. Number 8. You started accepting the bare minimum as enough. There was a time when effort had a standard. And then, quietly, that standard moved. Not because your needs disappeared, but because you adjusted them. A short reply felt better than silence. A vague plan felt better than none. A small check-in felt meaningful simply because it still existed. You didn't call it settling. You called it being realistic. You told yourself this is what long-term love looks like. Less intensity, less attention, less intention. But here's the shift you didn't notice. You stopped asking if this was enough for you and started asking if it was too much for them. Minimal effort became reassuring because it proved they hadn't fully disappeared. And when bare minimum feels like relief, it means the baseline has already dropped. You weren't asking for grand gestures. You weren't asking for constant validation. You were asking for consistency. And the moment you accepted inconsistency as something to be grateful for, the relationship stopped needing to grow. Because growth requires dissatisfaction, and you trained yourself to be satisfied with less. Not because less fulfilled you, but because it kept things going. Number 9. You felt lonely even when you were still together. There's a specific kind of loneliness that only shows up in relationships. It's not being alone, it's being unaccompanied. You were still talking, still spending time together, still technically in a relationship, but you felt unseen. You stopped sharing small things because they didn't seem to land. You stopped opening up because it felt like talking into space. You were present, but not met. And that loneliness was confusing because nothing was wrong enough to leave over. They weren't cruel, they weren't gone, they just weren't fully there. So you told yourself this was normal, that closeness fades, that depth comes and goes. But loneliness doesn't come from distance, it comes from imbalance, from being emotionally invested in something that isn't equally invested back. And the moment you feel lonely next to someone, you're no longer sharing the relationship, you're carrying it, with someone walking beside you, but not holding the same weight. That's when togetherness becomes exhausting, because you're not just loving anymore, you're sustaining. Number 10. You knew something was wrong, but you kept going anyway.
You didn't miss the signs. That's the part people don't like admitting. You felt the shift. You noticed the imbalance. You sensed that something fundamental had changed. But you kept going, not because you were unaware, but because stopping felt heavier than continuing. You told yourself it wasn't bad enough yet, that you didn't have a real reason to leave, that walking away would be an overreaction. So you waited for clarity that never came. You hoped effort would return without you having to ask for it. You hoped they would notice without you having to point it out. And deep down, you knew that hope was doing most of the work now.
This is the final moment people recognize too late. Not the argument, not the ending, but the moment you realized you were staying against your own awareness. Because once you know something is wrong and continue anyway, you're no longer choosing the relationship. You're choosing familiarity over honesty. And that's when carrying the relationship stops being temporary and starts becoming your identity. If you recognized more than a few moments in this list, you don't need more explanation. You already know what changed. Not at once, not dramatically, but slowly, through small adjustments you kept making to keep something alive that stopped meeting you halfway. This wasn't about love disappearing. It was about effort quietly becoming optional. And once effort becomes optional for one person, it becomes exhausting for the other. You weren't asking for too much. You weren't expecting perfection. You were asking for participation. And when participation stopped, you carried it instead. There's no villain in that story, just a truth that stayed unspoken for longer than it should have. Clarity doesn't come from blaming them, and it doesn't come from blaming yourself. It comes from recognizing that love isn't supposed to feel like maintenance. And once you see that, you stop replaying the past. You stop questioning your awareness. Because carrying the relationship alone was never a phase, it was the answer. And now that you can name it, you don't have to carry it forward anymore.